Good morning. You may be seated. A few years ago, if you're a cheapskate like me, you appreciated the advent of the e-card. You could take 15 seconds out of your busy day and for free send somebody a card and get credit for the thoughtfulness of a $4 card that you buy at Walgreens. Well, this morning I want to take extra advantage of that idea, and I want to share a Mother's Day greeting card with my mom, with you all present, through PowerPoint. So let's look at just a couple. So Mom, I can't even imagine how proud you are of me for remembering to send you a Mother's Day card. Which brings me to my next one. Thanks for helping me resolve the childhood issues that you caused. I'll pay for that. I'll pay for lunch too, so it'll be okay. And thirdly, Mom, I can never repay you for everything you've given me, including the $700 I'm about to ask for. So if you need to borrow a quick Mother's Day card, the internet's full of good ones for you. You know, I read a recent survey about Mother's Day and the church. It's actually said to be on the survey that it's the single most painful day on the church calendar each year. I guess cards and flowers and cookies are nice, but sometimes it's hard for families to hold it all together, and mothers feel that weight. Regrets, ongoing unresolved conflicts, mistakes that loom over some families like dark clouds, grief and loss for parents or children who have passed, infertility, broken relationships, addictions that have driven wedges into once solid homes. So many things fuel all of our complicated emotions on Mother's Day every year. And in that survey, I thought what was interesting is there was one reason in particular that I didn't really see coming that mothers shared about their heartaches on this day. It's a momentary, well-intended recognition by the church, only to once again slip back into feeling invisible and anonymous as moms for the rest of the year. And so, on Mother's Day, it's really easy to be up front and be cliche about how great our moms are, and about how without moms the world would be rudderless. And it really is true. But as a church today, what I want is every single mother, every daughter, and every son to leave here feeling encouraged from an unlikely story in the Old Testament I'll get to in just a minute. But I want moms to know that they matter, like really know it. Really know it. Your thoughts, your feelings are seen by God. Regardless of what reality's like in your home, He sees, He knows, He cares. You may be a super mom, you may be a selfish mom, and you may be any mom in between, but every mother deserves to be embraced on this day, to be cheered on, to let her know that we love our moms without judgment, no matter how the past has been or how the present is. Mother's Day, I believe, or how this is in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. We read the greatest commands in the Gospels frequently, not as often from here, and this actually is my favorite telling of this command. Let no debt remain outstanding, Paul says, except the continuing debt to love one another. Outstanding commandments. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. Adultery. Forget it. I'm not going to write every single command down. Just whatever other command there is, it can be summed up in just the one. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then this is the important part. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So, today the message is for every single mom. Whether you're a biological mom or an adoptive mom, a foster mother or a spiritual mother. Aspiring moms and grieving moms, confused moms, worried moms, remorseful moms, God sees every single one of you, and He cares. Maybe you're the mother with the family that everybody wishes they had. Your kids are brilliant, and they're athletic, and they're funny, and they're kind, and they're beautiful. Yet you still find time to volunteer at school and at Journeyland, and all the other moms secretly want to hate you, but they can't because you're just so nice, right? Maybe you're that mom, and maybe that's your family. You matter to God. He sees you. Maybe you're the mother in a family that's been overwhelmed by one problem after another. Your kids seem to have followed every wrong path in life, at least the path that you thought was wrong. He sees you. He cares about you. The mother who adopts, choosing to love somebody else's child, oh man, what a Christ-like love. He sees you. The single mom who feels completely alone, the mother of children from different fathers, the mom who's been through a miscarriage and every single day agonizes and wants a child to love of her own, the unwed mother who wonders if a church would accept her, the foster mom who shares her love and her home. He sees you. And you know, Mother's Day is really for children too, isn't it? Children who see their moms as heroes. Some children see their moms as a big old mess, and they want little to do with them, and they feel guilty for feeling that way, but that's reality for them. Children who seem to have become everything their mom wanted, and then other kids who've kind of done everything their mom didn't want. Those who've grown up choosing a different path than what their families wanted. Children who came today to show respect to their moms. You matter to God, and He sees you. I want to read you a story from Genesis about this God who sees. And so as background, I want to read you just a few verses from chapter 15 in Genesis, and then our main text in 16. Let's look at the first couple of verses in Genesis 15 about this God who sees. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And then the word of the Lord came to him. He took him outside and he said, look up at the sky, count the stars, if indeed you can count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. We love this story, right? Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So kind of put a finger in that story. Remember that promise that he made, because I promise you that Abram's wife, Sarai, she definitely remembers that promise. And now let's look at chapter 16. You can follow along on the screen. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar, and so she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. And Abram agreed to what Sarah said, and so Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived, and when she knew despised her mistress, you see how she's now turning the tables on Sarai. And then Sarai said to Abraham, you're responsible for the wrong that I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. And Abram says, your slave's in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. And then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. And the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It's the same desert, the Negev, where if sometime later the Israelites will wind up wandering 40 years looking for this God that Hagar is about to meet. And he says to her, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? Can you imagine that? Alone in the desert, and this is what you get? And she says, I'm running away from my mistress. And the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. And the angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they'll become too numerous to count. And the angel of the Lord said, hears, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He'll be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he'll live in hostility towards all his brothers. And then Hagar gives this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. I want you to hang on that. She said, for now I have seen the one who sees me. And so Hagar bore Abram a son at the age of 80. He was at the age of 86. So this story that promises from God to one woman about having a child, and then a separate promise to a different woman about having a child with the same man. It's a house full of jealousy and arrogance and cruelty and insecurity, people struggling to trust God, taking matters into their own hands, and to be honest with you, so much for that old notion that the good old days were just simpler, easier times. This is as complex as it gets. The story of two moms who felt completely invisible and a God who saw them both clearly. So, let's look at the beginning. Look at verse 2 with me. There's no mention that God does what Sarah thinks he's doing, that she's childless and that's shameful and somehow evidence that God's punishing her for being bad by making her not have any kids. All we can really read into this is that she's interpreting her situation to mean that God has prevented her from having kids and that she was childless because God saw her, in fact, but what he saw displeased him, and so he took away from her the very thing that she wanted. She didn't understand. So Sarah made a plan to help God, right? To get the kid that she wanted so desperately, and it was customary for a woman of her stature to use a servant woman to have an offspring so she could have an heir to her fortune. But then it was also customary to actually allow her husband to marry this woman. So Abram agrees, right? He's so passive in this story. He's like, yeah, sure, whatever. And so in some way that isn't described, once Abram sleeps with Hagar, she starts to feel overconfident, feeling like her place in the family is now super secure. It says that Hagar, the servant, the slave, actually resents Sarah, the master, for getting in her way of her family. Wow. And then Sarai, who's so far from perfect in this story herself, this whole having a baby with another woman, totally her idea, and yet when it starts to come unraveled, who does she blame it on? It's you, Abram. It's you, Hagar. It's y'all's fault. No chance is she interested in reconciling with Hagar. And Abram, if there had been lazy boys back in the day and there had been remote controls, that's where he would have been. Like, you handle that. You let me know when you come up with a solution. Whatever you say, honey, that's what I want, right? And so he just sits aside and lets it all happen. And it must have been really to Hagar and her disrespectful new attitude that she pushes her out the door. She's not changing subdivisions. She's going to the desert, pregnant and alone and really young. And this had all of a sudden become a winner-take-all rivalry. Winner-take-all. Back towards her home in Egypt, if she's even going to make it there, because apparently the rivalry had become so bad now that one more day in that home seemed worse to her than alone in the desert. And I love how this story moves forward, because you would think that the Hagar narrative would just kind of dissipate and go away, but it doesn't. Not at all. God doesn't even almost forget her. He sees her in her deepest struggle. So God now and Hagar are going to connect through what's described as an angel in this story out in the desert. In verse 8, if you go back and look at it, you can see the God who sees gives the consequences of her actions are going to be tough. And if she gets everything right from this point forward, how the and wondering where it all went wrong. So she's here in the middle of the desert, this unforgiving place, and she's certain of only one thing, and that she is not Sarai. That's what she knows. What she knows is she's nobody, she's pregnant, and there's no future. And then the Lord speaks to Hagar. He does something with Hagar that he doesn't ever do that we know in Scripture with Abraham or Sarah. He calls the foreign slave girl by her name, Hagar. Hagar. There's something about hearing your name, isn't there? Still today, when somebody uses your name, it makes you feel noticed and known. It makes you feel like you matter. And so he promises to Hagar, you do have a future through your son, Hagar, a son that will ultimately become a nation. Now, full disclosure, he actually promises her a wild donkey of a son that will not play well with others. Wrote on my report card. Now, to me, the idea of a wild child who can't get along with anybody, not sure I'm wanting that blessing. But to a mom, who's more perfect than her wild little donkey child? She's not a donkey to her, right? To Hagar, and can't get along with others. Give Hagar a break. He's gotten it all right all along. I love my boy. Isn't that really why moms blow our minds? Because when the whole world sees us like a kid who can't play well with others, when the whole world thinks that guy is a wild donkey, your mom doesn't. Moms represent undying hope that all of us are becoming a better version of ourselves. And surely it was kids who were trying to say thank you to their moms for believing in me like that invented Mother's Day back when it very first began. And also kind of the extra piece of Mother's Day, all of us kids are saying to our moms, I really hope the coming year is the year that begins to justify that belief that you have in me, right? So what does God tell Hagar to do out in the desert? He says, go back home. Go home. Turn right around. Follow your footprints in the sand till you get back to Sarah. And when you get there, I want you to get humble. I want you to submit to her. Because God is often in the place where you were sure that he was not. So he makes this promise to her in verse 10. It's a day that begins with no hope for her, but God gently tells her, you will become a mother, and your family will be a great nation. He calls her by name. He draws her into conversation. He doesn't silence or shame her. He notices her, and this deeply affects this woman who's so disconnected. And what does she do? She names God. Hagar, the slave girl, names the Lord, and it's a perfect name. The name is Yahweh El Roi, which means the Lord who sees, the God who sees. Do not for a minute let the significance of this be lost on you. Hagar, the young female slave, the outsider, becomes the only person in the Old Testament to name God. Well, what qualifies her? A face-to-face encounter with the Lord in desolation, despair, and a life in shambles is what qualifies her. Her experience does, because invisibility turns to recognition and hope with the Lord who sees. It's validation that her life matters, and her perspective then is validated further throughout Scripture. It's the same God we see in Proverbs 15 that says, the eyes of the Lord are everywhere, keeping watch on the wicked and the good. Or Psalm 139 is a great passage here. In verse 1, O Lord, you've examined my heart. You know everything about me. You know when I sit down and stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel, when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say before I say it, Lord. You go before me and you follow me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand. And then in the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 29, Jesus said, what are the price of 2 sparrows? 1 copper coin? But not a single sparrow can fall to the ground without your Father knowing it. And the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You're more valuable to God than a whole flock of sparrows. He knows every detail about Hagar. He sees every bit of it. Now, when you think of God as seeing, don't think of El Roi as a prison guard who's watching you closely for you to make a mistake. He's watching because he cares. And he doesn't watch because he needs the information. He's watching because he wants to have an intimate conversation and connection with you about what others would consider to be the mundane details of your life. What it meant then for a young mother was, in fact, she is not too small. She is not unimportant. She is not too fringe. She is not too other for the God who sees. Now, the Hagar, Abram, Sarai story is too rich, too complicated, not to mention Sarah in a favorable light as well. She was strong in her own way. She made a plan to start a family. I've heard the criticisms of her my whole life about how she's faithful or faithless and that Abraham was some great man of faith. I just read you the story. Neither one of them are winning a lot of prizes about faith there. The reality is maybe she didn't have the faith to trust God to provide, but forgive me if I'm not willing to judge a really old woman for engaging in a culturally accepted practice to try to have a child to her servant. Wasn't she doing what we say God does today? That she was helping herself through God? Or don't we always say God helps those who help themselves? I feel like that's what Sarah was doing. But let's look now in Genesis 17. The story's going to move forward. Sarah gets a promise in verse 16 when God says, I will bless Sarah. I will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. So there's that in chapter 17. And now look at in chapter 18. Chapter 18. So the promise gets really clear. 3 visitors show up. I think, scholars think, it's God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, the 3 of them coming to visit in the tent. And so the visitors say to Abraham, where's your wife, Sarah? There in the tent, he said. Then one of them said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent. Abraham and Sarah were already very old. Sarah was way past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself, like the quiet internal laugh. And she thought, after I'm worn out and old, now I'll have this pleasure? And then the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really have a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I'll return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah was afraid, so she lied. And she said, I didn't laugh. And he said, yes, you did laugh. Can you imagine when Sarah realized that this private laugh had been heard? Was she not freaking out on some level? The God who heard Hagar's cries of despair in the desert now hears Sarah's silent laugh of disbelief. I don't think now that Sarah is getting called out to shame her. I think it was just to clear up this nagging theological problem in her mind. She was learning that God could see her too. That nothing is too hard for the Lord. Someone else's blessing was not blocking the way forward for her and her promise of a future. Impossibilities, messes, others' victories, and even your family's dysfunction is nothing that God can't overcome. Do you believe that today? Do you believe today, right now, that nothing is too hard for the Lord? So there's these 2 women, both seen by El Roy, both of whom have received his promises. One was not at all a part of God's chosen community, and one was in the hall of fame of faith. Shocking lack of concern for her well-being, and God instead doubles down on taking care of Sarah. Abraham and Sarah bail out, don't even care if she dies, right? That's the harsh reality. Is they don't care, and God doubles down on taking care of her. So maybe you're familiar with this idea. I'm going to introduce a notion to you. It's called the zero-sum game. The zero-sum game is common in mathematics and gaming. It's essentially a situation in which one person or group can win something only by causing another person or group to lose it. Now, you think of it like dividing up a budget. It's a zero-sum game. Every little piece goes until there's nothing left. It's how you do any kind of financial thing. You have a certain amount of money, and when it's gone, it's gone. And sometimes, unfortunately, zero-sum game thinking is how our philosophy of God works. Sarah and Hagar were engaged in a zero-sum game where there's one winner, one loser, and it's not going to be me. The thing is God's not limited to a zero-sum game. Not even close. He can bless those, shocker, far outside of our poorly constructed limitations of Him. And at the same time, he can look out for someone that is really, really good, somebody that we really admire. In other words, God doesn't only bless the Abraham-Sarah power couple, he also looks over the Hagar-Ishmael mess at the same time. He can and does bring good to all kinds of women, to all kinds of mothers. The good, the not so good. And by the way, he's not ranking any moms. He's not comparing moms. Whether they see him or not, he sees them because he is El Roy. Now, being in a relationship with God, this is great news. It means that you and I are free from having to live zero-sum life games as well. We don't have to live like that because he doesn't live like that. It's not either you win or I win. That's totally false. It's not that. I don't win a thing when you lose, and I don't lose anything when you win. But the God who sees, we can. Nothing human can do the pattern. Even by our worst sin, God's always winning. And God's love will win. Love does not lose, nor does God lose. I love that. Matthew 6, verse 8 says, our Father knows what you need before you even ask him. So the unfailing, unrelenting, pursuing love of God tunnels through and underneath our mess, and it shows us a bright hope on the other side because he can now see us clearly. You see, the God who sees and hears is able to speak into each situation in just the right way, precisely because he took the time to look and to listen. Future, hope, those are real things because he took the time to notice. And what mattered to Hagar, like a chance at a real life, a child, an opportunity for security, it mattered to God too. So on this Mother's Day, it's this chance for children to also be grateful to our moms, to give praise in tangible ways to our moms and to our friends' moms and to our spiritual mothers and to our female mentors and to our teachers. Mother's Day is a chance for men to say out loud to their spouse or to the mother of their children, with their kids able to hear them say that we couldn't do it without you. Mother's Day is a chance for all of us to truly see our sisters in Christ, to share in their suffering, to celebrate victories, to refuse to compare, to want the best for all people. As Sarah and Abraham, if they had only been able to live like that, think what a great story this would have been. There's one last moment in Genesis 21. I won't read you the whole story, but Sarah has gotten Isaac. She's gotten that child of promise, and we love to celebrate that story. And it says that she's happy, and it says she's having a big party. And you know what she does? She's like, I can't be happy unless you get rid of Hagar once and for all. Get her out of here. I can't handle her another single moment. And so Abraham agrees. This is a terrible story. We talk about how Abraham and Isaac had this really powerful moment on the mountain, but he literally pushes his only other son into the desert, I guess to die with his mom, and sends her with like a little pouch of water and some food, and it runs out. And she's alone in the wilderness again. And she's afraid again, even though she'd met God, even though she'd named God, had a conversation with him. And what does he do? He provides for her one more time. Some of you need to hear this today. You really do. Even though Hagar had met the Lord before, she was still afraid. Some of you have had deeply spiritual encounters with God in the past, and yet today you're struggling to trust him. Still today, that's what happens to some of our best families when they forget that we will always be blind to what we need without the Lord who sees it for us. A once strong family of faith can revert all the way back to zero-sum thinking unless they look to El Roy to see it for them. Just because you don't see the future doesn't mean God can't see it. Not being able to trust God, that God sees us, is what leads people to take matters into their own hands. Not being able to trust that God sees us is what makes us afraid that someone else's blessing and success must mean my demise. And not being able to trust that God sees us is what makes us think only in terms of regret because all we can see is the past. Max Lucado, in his book, He Still Moves Stones, says this: we're blind. We're blind to the future. It's one of the limitations we all share. The wealthy just as blind as the poor, educated just as blind as the sightless, as the unschooled. None of us know how our children will turn out. None of us know the day we will die. None of us knows when he or she will marry, or even if the marriage, it lies before him or her. We are unequivocally, absolutely, unalterably blind. Despite our best choices, despite our best intentions, things don't always work out like we planned and dreamed. Sometimes we get in this internal struggle of very detailed plans for how my life must look. Every single bit of it we plan out. And when our vision gets that detailed and that future doesn't happen, it can overwhelm us. And you guys, I think this is exactly where Sarah lost her way. Her plan of what happiness and blessing looked like was so specific that when God brought her everything she could have hoped and more, and shocked her beyond belief, she can't be happy because Hagar's still in the picture. It's too detailed. To push fast forward and see how her kids will turn out. The mom who works and regrets the time she missed with her kids at home, and then the mom who stays at home and wishes she would have had a career. That's why trusting in a God who sees is way better than perfect plans with imperfect vision. All you wind up with then is regrets. Imagine if for just a moment, I'm telling you, the world's history may have changed if Sarah could have been grateful, kind, and not threatened, not self-important, if she would have embraced a young woman who needed to feel love instead of wrath. But for Sarah, it was a zero-sum game. If she could have just trusted God, and if Abraham could have gotten up off of his couch and turned off the TV and paid attention to these two women and really cared, can you imagine if he would have trusted him in that way? Because even when you feel invisible, Matthew 5 says, for he makes the sun rise. Matthew 5 says, trust. Matthew 5 says, you all have seen the movie Lion. If you've seen he and his older brother wound up at a train station, and Saru winds up on a train alone, and he gets confused. He's 4. He gets separated from his brother. I won't tell you the whole details of the movie, but needless to say, something happens to his brother. They don't reconnect, and Saru winds up running for his life that night and winds up in all these terrible encounters with child predators and traffickers, and he winds up in an orphanage, and he winds up, hope against hope, adopted by a family in far southern Australia, John and Sue Brierley. This little Indian boy winds up, it's a true story, winds up in Australia, raised by John and Sue Brierley. As a young adult, he starts wondering about home. He doesn't look like other people. And he starts looking and looking and looking. And this is in like 2010, 11, 12. I don't know if you guys ever looked at Google Earth app back then. Do you ever look at that? It's just fascinating. Well, this is what Saru does. He gets on Google Earth, and he just kind of, at night, he would just scan over detailed close-up looks of India. And one night he sees a water tower and a train track and a couple of buildings that thinks he recognizes. And he thinks, I think that's my home. And so he makes a trip to India to see if he can find his home. And you guys, it was his home. In 2012, he gets home and he meets his birth mother. And this is the actual pictures of Saru with his adopted mom, Sue, and his birth mother. And for 25 years, Saru's mom lived in the same village. You know why? Because she's a mom, and she never gave up hope that her little boy would come home one day, and he did. And the end of the movie, It's mind-blowing to me, these two women who could have been territorial and threatened and comparing, oh, well, I'm not her and you're not me, and having this big animosity to one another. They don't have that. There's this embrace and this love. And I wonder, what would it have been like for Hagar and Sarah thousands of years ago if they would have thought, this is not a zero-sum game. Everybody wins with the Lord who sees and provides. So on this Mother's Day, I hope nobody goes home feeling unseen. I hope there's no salt in the wound for a single mom, just a clearer vision of a God who sees you. You do not need to be a Proverbs 31 woman to be visible to Him. Not to your church family either. Being a mom is a high calling. It's tough. There's no winners when you compare yourself to someone else, so stop doing it. Your pregnancy and your nursing and the change in diapers and middle school insanity and all the other things that go along with being a mom, it's a lot. It's a lot. And so as a church trying to reflect the image of the God who sees, we say to you today, we see you. And may our love, along with the faithful love of the Lord, be just what you need to keep you away from insecurity and fears and zero-sum thinking. May you know that you are seen and admired and loved, and not just on a Sunday in May, but all year long. And may our faith in Jesus Christ rise as we realize that He sees us. And so somebody that's here today that needs to reconnect with the God who sees, whatever that looks like, we're here for you. We want you to come while Eric leads us in this song while we stand.